Well, joining us now to discuss this are Israeli columnist Gershon Baskin and the former chair of the Defence Select Committee, Tobias Ellwood. Good morning, both. We're going to start with you, Tobias. What do you think this means for the Israeli war effort and their goal of eradicating Hamas?
Well, maybe let's start with that war effort, because 6 months on, and this is an ally we're talking about that we want to see defeat Hamas, but 6 months on, this has clearly been a messy, clumsy invasion without an obvious objective, a strategy to get you there. So how is the Israelis' military action, its superior military might, leading to any form of success? I don't know what that is. And we've seen this conflict escalate beyond Gaza and Israel. And of course, the scale of collateral damage has been huge, not least to even British citizens being killed. And when Britain has to resort to using the Royal Navy to get in a maritime corridor to get aid in, and indeed do airdrops as well, something has gone very, very wrong indeed. And these are the questions that David Cameron, the Foreign Secretary, is wanting to ask, because the Eraz crossing, for example, which is in the north, the major crossing in the north of Gaza, has been closed this entire time, right next to Gaza City. And that should not have been closed. Neither should that huge maritime port that Israel has, the container port. No humanitarian aid has come through there. That has now changed because of pressure by the West. But we're in a very difficult situation here. We must abide by international law. So if it's proved that Israel is breaching humanitarian law, then we have no choice but to freeze our arms exports. But that is for the FCDO number 10 to make that judgment.
And Tobias, just on that, of course, we're hearing different kind of rhetoric now from the Prime Minister. He says the nation remains appalled. He wants a humanitarian pause immediately, leading to a long-term sustainable ceasefire. You mentioned the Royal Navy there also going in. We've pledged another £9.7 million in aid to Gaza, trying to establish that humanitarian corridor between Cyprus and with Gaza as well. Netanyahu is looking increasingly isolated on the world stage. We've got this evidence possibly that Alicia Kearns has talked about whether Israel has breached humanitarian law. Pressure, as you rightly say, coming from the United Kingdom and the United States. And the other point that you made, which was a very good one, which is about how this is escalating. And now you've got Iran actually vowing revenge against Israel after those Israeli attacks on Iran's consulate in Syria. So how does this play out when you've also got people in Israel protesting, saying Netanyahu does not represent us?
Yes, I think this is the point that I alluded to, but you put your finger on it. This is all about Prime Minister Netanyahu trying to save his job, I think. You know, he made this big promise. His whole purpose, if you like, of the last couple of decades was to say, support me, let me lead Israel, and you will be safe. Now, that all came crashing down on the 7th of October, and he's wanted to show some form of response. But we haven't thought through exactly what that response should be and where it goes. The difficulty is that we require the cooperation of Israel to get aid into Gaza. At the moment, it's about just over 100 lorries a day. It should be 500. We need Israel's support for that. Otherwise, famine will break out. We need Israel's cooperation to prevent this escalating further and ultimately to participate in two-state talks. So the question is, if we actually did impose some form of sanctions or freeze our arms sales, would we yield later a greater influence or not? And that is the concern we have, separate as to whether international law has been breached or not. Very, very difficult questions requiring a lot of statecraft at this moment.
And just bringing in Gershon Baskin, a hostage negotiator, not a columnist, as we accidentally said earlier. We know there was a recovery of the body of an Israeli hostage, Elad Katzir, over the weekend. He was recovered on Saturday. His sister actually blamed the Israeli authorities over her brother's death in a post on social media, saying that he actually would have returned alive if Israel had agreed to a new truce deal. What do you make of that, Gershon?
Well, I think it's true. I mean, I've been saying since the very first week of the war that every day that the hostages remain in Gaza is a danger to their lives, whether they're killed by Israeli bombing or by being executed by Hamas. We're now on day 185. We passed the 6-month mark. There are now 133 hostages left in Gaza. There's a dispute on how many of them are alive, but it's assumed that probably less than half of them are alive today, and everything must be done to bring them home. There are negotiations ongoing. There were the highest level negotiations taking place yesterday in Cairo because President Biden applied extreme pressure on Mr. Netanyahu and sent the head of the CIA to Cairo, where he met the head of the Mossad and the head of Egyptian Central Intelligence and the Qatari Prime Minister. Now the sides are going back home to their capitals for consultations. The Hamas are holding their internal consultations, and I hope that we will see progress. There is increased aid going into Gaza now. Yesterday, there were more than 300 lorries that entered Gaza. I think that the Israelis have understood that this is an issue that they need to remove from the agenda. And my understanding is that the Israelis intend to flood Gaza with humanitarian aid, and that should have been done a long time ago. But if it's done now, that's a good thing. We also have a target date right in front of us. We're at the end of the holy month of Ramadan, and there's a 4-day Eid al-Fitr holiday, which might be a good time for the sides to have a ceasefire to cool off. The Israeli withdrawal from southern Gaza might facilitate that ceasefire, and if it's part of the negotiations, that would be a very good sign.
Tobias, this all revolves around the geopolitics. It's an incredibly complex situation. We also have Israel and Hamas at loggerheads over what the outcome or the solution might be. We've got these ceasefire talks taking place with the US, the Qataris, Egypt, Israel, and Hamas. But they're poles apart. If we're talking about a two-state solution, which you and I have discussed a great deal, Israel doesn't want that, according to Netanyahu. Hamas doesn't want that. How do you square that circle?
Well, exactly. If Netanyahu doesn't want it, is he the right person to be leading Israel? That is a question for the Israeli people. But Israel as a whole, their position has been for decades, and I know this because I was the Middle East minister for a number of years, has been publicly to say, yes, we will pursue a two-state solution, but we require peace from Gaza. And the challenge has been, well, Hamas is in charge, and we can't now work with Hamas. And I understand that. We all understand that after what happened after the 7th of October. So the question is, who can you work with? What will be the governance and security structure for Gaza, which will assure Israel that this won't be repeated? And that's the difficulties that we face. I would say because of the manner in which Israel has gone about this attack, they've actually allowed Hamas to develop in its recruitment, because so many normal Gazans have said, I'm fed up with this, I'm going to join and I'm going to fight. So you need to recognize this bigger picture here. There's no doubt Israelis' behavior must change. 6 months on, this conflict continues to escalate, as you implied, and the West's patience is starting to ebb away with no obvious strategy that sits behind what Prime Minister Netanyahu is trying to achieve.
And of course, this behaviour only strengthens radicalisation. I want to bring it home, if I can, Tobias. Exactly. This poll over the weekend by the Henry Jackson Society of UK Muslims in this country, 1 in 4 British Muslims believe that Hamas, only 1 in 4, 25%, only 25% believe that Hamas committed murder and rape. 46% of British Muslims said they sympathise with Hamas. When you look at the numbers and you break it down, they're most likely to be younger and well-educated UK Muslims. That shows, according to Alan Mendoza, the executive director of the Henry Jackson Society, that actually we have failed in this country in terms of counter-extremism policy.
We are failing, there's no doubt about that. And you take that a step forward and you end up with homegrown radicalization, because if people do have a distorted view of what is going on, it's very easy then to recruit them to do something more sinister. And that is a concern that we have. MI6 have made that very, very clear, as has the government as well. There's also a responsibility, if I may humbly say this, to the Muslim community to be able to spell out the differences between Hamas and the Palestinian authorities, Fatah, to distinguish between what Hamas has done in the past, and therefore put it into clarity as to why Israel responded in the way that it's done. If you don't have that detail, then yes, you're going to end up, and we've seen it on the streets of London and elsewhere as well, with banners actually supporting Hamas as well. There's an absolute imperative to educate everybody, all of Britain, but including those in the Muslim community. And it is then a question as to where their news source is actually coming from in today's day and age, where you can be very selective in what messaging you actually want to hear. That's the concern that we need to address.
It's interesting, isn't it, Tobias, because it says on that strap there, 47% of 18 to 24-year-olds don't think terrorist group committed atrocities. What's not clear is whether or not they think that what happened was atrocious or whether it didn't happen in the first place and they believe it's some kind of, social media or media conspiracy.
Yes, that's exactly it. And it is that messaging that is so critical. It's important to be able to discuss this. There was a question that came up, I think, a couple of weeks ago as to whether in the classrooms, teachers were allowed to discuss this. And I think the answer was, no, we're not going to go near it. Well, my argument would be, yes, you must actually debate and discuss these difficult issues. That's the time to start learning about the world around you, but learning from an objective perspective, not a subjective perspective.
Yeah, let's bring in Gershon, just finally, if I may. So in terms of where we are, you mentioned we think about 130 hostages are still held. We believe 34 of those may well be dead. We've heard the figures from Hamas of 33,000 deaths in Gaza, 75,000 injured. How do you see this playing out? Because when you look at Hamas's demands and the demands of Israel, they are polar opposites. Israel says it will not agree to a ceasefire until the hostages are released. Now, when you look at what Hamas is saying, they're saying we need a permanent ceasefire before we even consider releasing those hostages. How does this actually play out?
I think it's really important to understand that the public statements made are part of the negotiation and not necessarily a reflection of what's going on in the negotiations themselves. I think it is essential, as Mr. Ellwood said, that there be a political endgame to this war, which is absent. The political endgame must be that we have to know who the keys are going to be turned over into Gaza if we want to eliminate Hamas. And the biggest enemy of Hamas is advancing the two-state solution. So if the UK wants to be part of the victory for the two-state solution, it is time for the UK to also recognize the state of Palestine. 30 years, not only has Israel and others talked about the two-state solution, but so has the United Kingdom. And it's time to recognize the other of the two states in order to make it real. And this will put us on the path to defeating Hamas ideologically and politically. And it's essential. The UK has historic responsibility here. And I think there's nothing wrong with the UK taking the lead on it, even ahead of the United States. The US will follow, others will follow. It's time to take that first crucial step to make the two-state solution real.
Well, thank you so much. Hostage negotiator Gershon Baskin and Conservative MP Tobias Ellwood. They're two fascinating guests. Thank you for joining us.